Okay, are you seeing?
Yep.
Okay, you're not seeing presenter mode, are you?
Nope, just your slides. So looks good. And I think we are ready to get started whenever. We have all our residents here. And then it sounded like you were thinking this would take till about 10:15 or so and then time for a break. But let me know.
Yeah, I think so. I think I got my times a little off because I thought it was 9:15 to 11:45 for some reason, but that shouldn't really matter. So yeah, we can go ahead and get started. So yeah, so hi everybody. This first session will be about an hour, probably about an hour, because I want to give everybody a break in the middle. I don't want this to go for 2.5 hours without people being able to get up and stretch their legs. Okay, so yeah, probably about an hour, I would say, because I think the second session will be an hour and a half. Okay, so I guess I'll start by introducing myself. There's a lot of you on here, and I don't think I know most of you. So my name's Eliza Monroe Wise. I'm an internist and an infectious disease specialist. I did my training at UW, and now I'm faculty at UW. And I am based in Nairobi, Kenya. And I'm part of the Department of Global Health. I do research on HIV testing among key populations here, and I do a lot of medical education work as well. I've been working with Carrie Farquhar for a very long time. Some of you may know her. And today I'm going to be talking about gender and gender in leadership and in health. And before I begin, I want to just state that my pronouns are she and her. And I also want to state that I, as a teacher, I really enjoy interactive teaching. And so with Zoom, that's a lot harder to do. But I tried to make this as interactive as possible. And I have the chat open here, so I'm going to use that, and I hope that you all use it, and I will be able to see what you're chatting as we go. So please interrupt me if you have a comment or a question, or go ahead and put stuff in the chat, or I think those are probably the best things. I might not see it if you raise your hand, and then we'll do the polls as well. Okay, so let's start with an outline. So why are we talking about gender today? That's where we're going to start. And then we're going to spend some time talking about what gender is and how gender is different from sex. And then we're going to go back to why are we talking about gender and put it in the context of gender in healthcare and gender, actually not so much in leadership, but as gender in careers in medicine, really. Okay, so why are we talking about gender? That's the first part of what we're going to talk about. So this brings up poll number 1. And Lauren, if you want to go ahead and launch that poll. The poll is, there are not major differences in how physicians treat patients or in how physicians are treated by their employers based on gender. True or false? Okay, first of all, I just want to say thank you all for engaging and voting. So 45 out of 45 said false. All right, I'm preaching to the choir here. And somebody posted in the chat a link to a New England Journal of Medicine article on physician gender pay gap, and we will get to that later. So it seems that everybody here believes that there are major differences in how physicians treat patients and how physicians are treated by their employers based on gender, and I agree with that. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to share the results so you can see what I'm seeing. So yes, all of you said false, so yay, great. We can move on to the next part, which is definitions of sex and gender. So let's define sex first. I don't know how much instruction you all have gotten about gender in medical school or in residency. I know that when I was in medical school, which is a long time ago now, I had almost no instruction on this. But it's so vitally important for us to all understand as physicians how to approach this. So I would like for you all to try and give me a definition of sex. And I'm talking about not the act between two or more people, but the biological determination that is usually signed at birth. What is the definition of that? And you can put it in the chat. Or you can shout it out if you want to unmute yourself. Chromosomes. Okay, chromosomes are definitely a part of it. Anyone have any other ideas of how we might define sex? Okay, Izzy says a phenotypic appearance assigned based on external characteristics. Not sure that entirely captures it. Okay, that's a big part of it for sure. And it's interesting because the two people who have posted in the chat have now covered generally how babies are defined a sex or assigned a sex when they're born or before they're born. Any other ideas about how it can be defined? Okay, I will give you the definition from the American Heritage Dictionary. Kevin says, oh, okay, we've got also on basis of reproductive biologic status, okay, whether or not someone can reproduce and with whom. It is a complicated term and can often be deconstructed if you only use one basis for the definition. For instance, chromosomes can be XXY or XO or XXX exactly. Okay, so the American Heritage Dictionary says either of the two divisions designated female and male by which most organisms are classified on the basis of their reproductive organs and functions. So, does anyone have any issues with that dictionary definition? Anything wrong with defining it that way? I'm gonna put my phone on mute. Yeah, so Tori says assumes a binary, assumes that reproductive organs are a binary, which they aren't. Oh, can you go back a slide? Yeah, back to the definition. So either of the two divisions designated female and male by which most organisms are classified on the basis of their reproductive organs and functions. And I looked up this definition in multiple dictionaries and they almost all said male and female. So yeah, that's one of the big issues that I have is that it's binary. Exactly, so there's intersex. So let's talk about, oh, this brings me to the next poll. So how many biologic sexes do you think there are in humans? Lauren, if you want to go ahead and launch. Yeah, there we go. I did not include one as an option here. All right, we've got 38 people have voted, 44. I seem to be managing the waiting room. Okay. Can you all see the results of that poll? I want to stop for a second and say welcome to the students in the Global Health Leadership course that are joining us. We actually started at 9, so I gave you the wrong time. So the results of the poll are very interesting. It was basically split between indefinite and I don't know. So thank you for your honesty. Some people said 2, 3 people said that. So I'm happy to see that not that many people said 2. I think that's sort of the typical traditional answer. 3 is also was chosen 4 times here, and other was chosen 3 times. If any of the people who selected other want to venture to put your thoughts into the chat box, I would love to hear what you think. Okay, so I personally think that it's more along the lines of indefinite, which is what the majority of you chose. And here is why I think that. So I'll just do a little bit of background here on the science. So somebody said chromosomes when we first started talking about what defines sex. And yes, that is sort of the traditional thinking, is that the arrangement of your chromosomes is what determines whether you are a female or a male. However, with the chromosomes, if we're just strictly going to look at that, somebody in the chat box already mentioned this, but there is a wide variety of chromosomal arrangements that we see. There's XO, which is Turner syndrome. There's Klinefelter syndrome, which is XXY or XXYY. There's, you know, these tetrasomies, and there's numerous arrangements. And so this table over here is from an old publication, and I actually have some issues with this, namely that they are categorizing these different chromosomal variations into male and female. I don't think that really makes much sense. And then the other thing is they call some of these phenotypes normal, and then other ones, you know, are Turner syndrome or whatever. So I would just say that these are all variants, and that even when we're just looking purely at chromosomes, a binary doesn't really make much sense. Okay, and then going beyond the chromosomal arrangement, we also have chimerism, mosaicism. So these are 2 different things that result in people's cells being of different genetic composition. And so we can have people who have genitals of one gender or one sex and other body parts of another. And this also, so people sometimes use the term intersex for people in these categories. We also have a wide range of hormonal imbalances that can lead to varying states of sexual development. So congenital adrenal hyperplasia, for instance, decreases the testosterone level. This syndrome, SLOS, it's a cholesterol production disorder that results in decreased synthesis of sex steroids. And then I'm sure we all know about the last, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So these are people who are born with XY, but they look more like people who have XX. So in any case, and these are just a handful of a wide range of conditions that people have that that make sex really not a binary distribution, and not clear in many cases. Okay, so just to recap that, there are chromosomal differences, there are differences in genetic expression, there's differences in genetic mutations, there is hormone production differences and hormone receptor levels. So it's just a wide range of things that can go that have variation in the whole not pathogenesis, but genesis of sexual differentiation. All right, so going back to the poll, does anybody think differently now? If you want to volunteer. Andrew Wilmington said, there's obviously not a right answer to this. Indefinite is probably most accurate, but basically there are two relatively well-defined sex categories with a relatively high level of intergroup agreement in terms of biology and anatomy, though of course not entirely homogeneous. And there are a small subset of the population that does not fit cleanly into these two categories and compose a highly heterogeneous group and frequently ostracized. That's absolutely right. Yeah. And if anybody has any other thoughts about your answers on the poll, or you know, how many sexes there are, please feel free to share in the chat. Okay, I'm gonna go forward to the next poll, which is, are you 100% certain of your own biologic sex? I love that these polls are completely anonymous. Wow, this is, so far the answer is not what I expected. Great. So the majority of you said no, that you were not 100% certain of your own biologic sex. Hasib says absolutism is always, absolutely always wrong, which I agree with. So yeah, +1. Great. So I don't think anybody can ever be 100% certain without, you know, having some chromosomal or genetic analysis of many different body parts. Great. Okay, so let's move on to gender. Just looking at the chats. Okay, so let's define gender now. Anyone want to take a stab at defining gender in the chat box? And in particular, what's different about gender from sex? How is gender different from sex? Anyone? Anyone want to help define gender? Okay, so perception of someone's sexual identity, both self-perception and society's perception. Okay, exactly. The way a person identifies could be congruent with their sex assigned at birth or not. Gender is a social linguistic construct. How you feel on the inside about who you are. Gender is a socially constructed set of norms. Yep, socially constructed. Okay, so yeah, you all have a pretty good grasp on this. So gender refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys. This again is a definition that I pulled out of a dictionary, that are socially constructed. This includes norms, behaviors, and roles associated with being a woman, man, girl, or boy, as well as relationships with each other. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time. Sex seems like something that is predefined at birth, not chosen, but gender is more of an identity that people can have from their own feelings or how society sees them. Yep, and it's an identity category that has to do with how you see yourself. Yeah. So I also take some issue with this definition of gender, because again, we're seeing these categories men, women, girl, boys, neatly packaged, categories. And I personally don't think that that makes sense, which brings me to the next poll. How many genders are there in humans? Great. So the vast majority of you thought that there were infinite genders. A few of you thought there was other, so not 2, 3, or 4, but maybe some concrete number, but we just don't have that option. And several of you said that you didn't know. So I think that this sort of reflects that, well, I'll talk about this in a minute. So let's keep going here. So just to get into gender a little bit, this is just a smattering from Anthropology of different cultures around the world that identify and accept more than 2 genders. So Native Hawaiians and Tahitians have this concept of mahu, I think, which is an intermediate gender. And there's a Native American group that has a gender spectrum of 4 different genders, and it's varying levels of masculinity and femininity. And then Polynesia has a fa'afine, can't pronounce that, but a 3rd gender, as does India with something called hydras. So that I think there are many, many other cultures around the world that recognize and identify more than just a binary distinction in gender. So I think we all agree, or maybe not all of us, but most of us from the poll, that gender is a spectrum. And this is something that I also feel our society is beginning to kind of accept and discuss more openly in recent years, which is great. So this is one schematic of how we can talk about a gender spectrum or different ways that people identify in terms of gender. So we have a male-female kind of spectrum going left to right, and then we have agender on the top and gender fluid on the bottom. So agender refers to people who don't identify with either male or female gender, and gender fluid refers to people who may change from time to time, between one side of the spectrum and the other. And there are other terms, and I'm not going to get into the terms. I'm not an expert on this. I'm sure some of you know more about it than I do. But we also should recognize that the terms transgender, which refers to someone who doesn't identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth, and cisgender, which is someone who does identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Non-binary is a term that just refers to, it's sort of a blanket term, who doesn't identify with exclusively male or female, so rejects the binary. Gender fluid we talked about already. There's also this term gender queer, which refers to someone whose gender identity falls on the spectrum between male and female. Okay, so last poll. We already talked about whether you're certain of your own sex. This one is whether you're certain of your own gender. Great. Thank you all for participating. So it looks like 84% of you are 100% certain of your own gender, while about 18% are not. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up is, that this can be a difficult thing to talk about or to kind of be open about. And I wanted just to point out to you all that 18% of your colleagues may, not be sure of their gender and may be going through, a process of trying to understand their own gender. So, and I would say, that this probably represents about the percentage of people who are not certain of their gender in society, and people probably don't talk about it enough. Okay, Tess in the chat box says, sorry for my ignorance, but from that prior slide, can you or someone explain a little more between gender queer and non-binary? I didn't get to read them closely, but my brief read of those definitions seems similar to me. Okay, let me see if I can go back.
I can explain a little bit as someone who identifies as non-binary. So
that'd be great.
With non-binary, it's more about rejecting the binary, and some people who identify as genderqueer might think of it as like a negative term, in the sense that genderqueer people don't even want to recognize that there is a binary, whereas non-binary is kind of like actively rejecting the binary. But it's really just all about like kind of using the terms that other people are using for themselves. And oftentimes like these terms kind of overlap. Like people will sometimes, agree and think that they're non-binary, or some days they might feel like they're more genderqueer. So I think it's just about reflecting whatever terms people are using.
Thank you. That is very helpful. All right. You all have probably seen this on the internet, and I'm not going to go into it in great detail. It just sort of demonstrates the difference between gender identity, attraction, and expression, and sex. So the reason I put this here was that I wanted to point out that this is the Genderbread Person version 2.0. There was a previous version. And what's different about this version is, I got my laser pointer here, that the spectrum, or the spectra, I guess, that they have for each of these, so this is gender identity, expression, biologic sex, and attraction, it's not going now opposite from each other, so you don't have female on one side of the spectrum and male on the other side. And I think this is actually relevant to what we were just talking about, where the opposite side of the spectrum is actually the absence of it rather than the other gender, if that makes sense. So this allows for the option of not having a gender, rather than just being on some spectrum of maleness or femaleness, if that makes sense. So that's just for you all to understand that, these things are evolving, and this sort of more accurately represents the actual spectrum of how people identify. All right. I'm going to take a pause for a second for any questions or discussion, and then I want to make a disclaimer and a blanket statement. Lizzie says, to elaborate on that point, as someone who identifies as genderqueer, I think of the gender binary as oppressive, and so the term non-binary to me evokes that oppression. I actively don't want to identify myself in relation to the binary. I think each person's answer may be different. Thank you, Lizzie. That's helpful. Okay, any other comments or questions? Kevin and Lizzie, as people who are living this, do you have any other thoughts to share or any insights? All right. So the disclaimer I want to make is that up until now, what we've been talking about is how this binary, both for sex and for gender, oh, that's good, Kevin. So we've been talking about this as kind of a rejection of this binary that, you know, both for sex and for gender, it doesn't really make sense to put things in these two rigid categories. We're going to pivot now and talk about gender inequality and gender bias. And for most of the rest of the discussion, it will be that old familiar binary, unfortunately, because that's what has been studied and what people write about. I mean, people certainly have studied and written about non-binary gender and sex as well, but the majority of research we have on gender inequality and gender discrimination and bias is refers back to that old binary of men and women. So a lot of what we're going to talk about from here on out is with reference to that binary. But the blanket statement that I want to make is that anytime that we're talking about gender inequalities, and when we're, especially in this dichotomy, this binary, what we all have to remember is that people who don't fit into the binary fare worse than people who do. So we may be saying that, you know, there's inequalities and that women, you know, for instance, we're going to talk about that physician pay gap and show that women make less money than men. And in any of these examples that we bring up, people who don't fit neatly into the binary, we can just assume almost always across the boards are going to be, you know, discriminated against worse than either of the categories that we're talking about. All right, so that's the blanket statement. All right, so gender and health. This is a very simple table here, just showing life expectancy in America by gender, by binary gender. And the point I want to make here is that there's a difference in life expectancy. So men live, or women live longer than men. Men live shorter, and that gender gap in life expectancy has actually increased since 1900. It's decreased since 1950 slightly, but it has increased since in the last 120 years. So why is that? Let's get into it a little bit. Here are the top 10 causes of binary gender in the US. And what you can see, is here on the side with men, we have unintentional injuries, very high, number 3.
Eliza,
oh, you can't hear me?
Yeah. But for like 15-20 seconds you were very staticky, so if you could repeat 15.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Okay. So all I was saying was, why is there this, you know, discrepancy in life expectancy between men and women? And we're looking here at the top 10 causes of death between this binary gender. And what we're seeing is that unintentional injuries are number 3 for men, and suicide here. Sorry, folks, I'm not sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you sound fine now again.
I wonder if it's when I use this pen thing. Maybe I'll stop doing that.
Actually, maybe.
It's weird.
I don't understand that, but try it without for a minute.
Okay. And then on the women's side, we've got Alzheimer's here at number 4, or no, sorry, number 5. And so I guess the reason I want to bring this up is to ask you and think about whether this is a biologic distinction or if this is a societal distinction that is causing these discrepancies in death by gender. What do people think? And obviously this is different for the different diseases here, different causes of death, but any thoughts here? Mostly gender, but both at play. Seems at least partly societal, violent traumatic causes of death higher in men, yes. Most likely due to differences in traditional gender roles. Yep, different social determinants of health, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, it's a combination, don't get me wrong. Like this Alzheimer's disease over here with women, I think that's mostly actually biologic. But unintentional injuries and suicide, which is decreasing men's life expectancy, is those are societal, mainly. So just a moment to kind of put into perspective here that so many of the illnesses and diseases that we encounter as physicians are gender and sex both play a huge role. So, you know, when we do research, we oftentimes do these logistic regression analyses, and it's almost always gender is like the first, you know, age and gender are the two things that are always linked to outcomes. So gender is just a risk factor for so many health outcomes. And this is just a smattering of the ones that actually exist. And I'll just point out, COVID-19 is right here. And I think we still don't understand why men are at higher risk for COVID and at higher risk for bad outcomes from COVID. So here's just a few examples of how gender roles and norms in society affect health. So for instance, in the US and in most countries, women earn significantly less money than men for similar work, and that has an effect on people's health. In Vietnam, many more men than women smoke, as female smoking has not traditionally been considered appropriate. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention when we were talking about life expectancy and that gap in life expectancy, that is a trend that we see in every country in the world. And it's the same. It's women live longer than men. And so here are some of the explanations in other parts of the world. So we saw in the US, the top 10 causes of death. In Saudi Arabia, men are allowed to drive cars while women are not. And while that may be unfair to women, it probably puts them at lower risk for, you know, getting into accidents. All right, so we're gonna talk a little bit now about gender inequality and bias. So here are just some definitions of gender inequality. Unequal treatment or perceptions of individuals based on their gender arising from differences in socially constructed gender roles. And then this other one that I found I liked a little bit because it says differences between men and women which systematically empower one group to the detriment of the other. And so we have to think about, you know, empowerment as oftentimes taking something away from the other group that is not being empowered. And gender inequalities are reflected in most societies and societal norms and institutions and policies in so many ways. So this is a day where we talk about global health. And I wanted to share this particular image. So this is a gender inequality index from the Human Development report. And basically it's an index of how much inequality exists between the genders in different countries. So they look at reproductive health, empowerment, and economic status of the two genders and then calculate this index. And the reason I wanted to share this is that this map looks so much like the disease burden for so many diseases that we talk about in global health. It could be a map of malaria. It could be a map of maternal mortality or neonatal mortality. It could be almost any global burden of disease index, because so much global burden of disease is centered in sub-Saharan Africa and and Asia. So, so there's this parallel, I think, between gender inequality and some of the the global burden of disease, essentially. I see something in the chat. These sorts of trends also track with more marginalized gender identities and sexualities. For instance, much higher rates of smoking. Yeah. And this is a similar map. So this is just one simple question. Are non-pregnant and non-nursing women allowed to do the same jobs as men? So is there a law that says that either all people should be allowed to do all the same jobs, or the opposite side saying women are specifically excluded from X, Y, and Z jobs? And so again, this map could practically be a map of a global, global health outcome, with the notable exception of France. Not sure what that's about. So for gender inequity in health, there's these two conceptually distinct dimensions. So there's biologically specific health needs that are not equally accommodated. So men and women have some different diseases that need attention. Do men get more attention than women on their specific diseases? But then there's also inequalities in health and health care arising from unfair gender relations. So do we as healthcare systems treat men and women the same way? And that's what we're going to talk about next. So anybody want to venture a guess as to what this is a picture of? This is trying to give some background as to the history of how we approach women in healthcare. Anybody know who this guy is? All right. So this Freud, yes. Thank you, Billy and Sarah. So this is Sigmund Freud. And this is yes, Lauren, this is hysteria. Good. So this is an image of a woman being treated for something that Freud coined, a term that Freud coined, which is hysteria, which was this concept rooted in stereotypes about women, that they are weak, needy, attention-seeking, and that they experience psychological distress out of proportion to their male counterparts, and that psychological distress can present in odd neurologic symptoms that may require hospitalization. So that concept, which really took hold in the late 1800s and early 1900s, has sort of set the stage for the ways in which women are treated by healthcare systems even today. So there's been some people writing recently about how women are treated in healthcare. And one of the things that has been noted is that debilitating disorders that predominantly affect women are massively understudied, underfunded, and underdiagnosed. So, these are all diagnoses here that I'm sure all of us, when we look at this, we kind of like feel a little uncomfortable because we don't know really how to diagnose or treat people who have these problems. Fibromyalgia, chronic pain, chronic fatigue syndrome, autoimmune disorders. And these are all disorders that are predominantly experienced by women and have resulted in decades of being neglected by the scientific community, which is, I think, partially why all of us may look at this and say, ooh, I don't know how to do anything for that. That's because we don't have a lot of research on it. So there's a history here in the US of women being enrolled in research studies. So before the 1990s, women were specifically and intentionally excluded from clinical research as participants. There were these ideas that, women might become pregnant or that their hormones may fluctuate and that might affect the outcomes of your study. And so women were excluded. It wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that people started thinking about this and saying, hey, we might not actually know very much about women's health if we don't study it. And so in 1990, the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health was created. And in 1993, something happened at NIH also called the Revitalization Act, where they basically said that research must include enough women in order to analyze the results by gender. And there's a few comments in the chat here. Yeah, it's so connected to women's health. So the connection between hysteria and the Latin root for womb, so the same thing as like hysterectomy. And then women were considered a special population in many cardiovascular studies in the past. I've heard some podcast stories lately about a lot more women turning to naturopathy, because a lot of these issues are being ignored by allopathic medicine, or at least because allopathic medicine doesn't really have answers. Yeah, I'm sure that's happening, unfortunately. And Seth is sharing a link to more on including sex and gender in research. That's great. So what has happened since the Revitalization Act? What do you all think? Are we now equally studying women and men? That's sort of a rhetorical question. Yeah, thank you, Priyanka. No, we are not. So this study was just from a year ago, and it shows the percentage of patients who are women for each of these diseases, and then the participants in studies, and then the participants in clinical trials. And so you can see that women are not represented as participants in research to the extent that they are patients in these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 disorders. There are some, so these are conditions where women were evenly represented. So diabetes, mental health, cancers affecting all genders, and respiratory. And then there are 2 where they found that women were actually overrepresented. Now, I had thoughts looking at this. I wonder if any of you have thoughts looking at this. Anisha says hysterical. I'm not sure. Anisha, do you want to explain what's hysterical? Whether you're talking about like hysteria, or if anybody else has thoughts about this. Women in pain are painted as hysterical. Yeah. Yeah, so I think you might be saying what I thought looking at this, which is that, yeah, this really harkens back to this whole idea of hysteria, that, women are in pain, women experience these strange, neurologic symptoms that are related to their psychological stress, and that perhaps these musculoskeletal and neurologic disorders where women are actually overrepresented, it's because we have this bias that these are the conditions that women suffer from. Kevin says, also important to make sure research is intersectional. Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Intersections of race, disability, age, socioeconomic status, and gender related to complaints often portrayed as psychosomatic, not real medical complaints. Exactly, Priyanka, I agree. Okay, the last thing that I want to quickly get into, and at the risk of depressing you all, who are all medical professionals, is gender equality or inequality in health professions. So to start off with, there's been quite a bit of research, and I think there's polls every year about what physicians make. This one is a multivariable regression model of the current salary of respondents who received initial K award funding. So they got K awards in 2000 and 2003, and then they asked them later on what their current salary was. And you can see gender, there were a few things here that were significantly associated with salary, but gender was very significantly associated, and men made, in this final model, $14,000 more per year than women. This is showing the same thing, but just not early career people. So at any stage in their career. And this also shows changes over time. So everybody's making more money than they made in 2012. So that's great. But women are still making far less than men across the boards. And this difference is particularly felt in specialties or subspecialties. This I found very interesting. So the gender wage gap is a phenomenon all over the world. And my inclination was to assume that higher income countries would have a lower wage gap, but I was wrong. So what this shows is that countries with higher GDP, so GDP is down here on the x-axis, actually had a higher gender wage gap generally. So this whole quadrant here is, high income countries with high gender wage gap. And then the lower income countries over here are sort of more down closer to the 0%, or some of them are even negative. Okay, so research, I'm sure a lot of you want to go into research. This chart comes straight from the NIH website, and this is awards by gender and percentage to women. So these lighter colored bars are men's awards over time, and these darker colored bars are women's awards over time. And so while a good thing that's happening is that women are sort of steadily creeping up and getting more NIH awards, while men are sort of stagnant up here, the percentage of awards that go to women is here on the red line, and it's still not even at 40%. It's like around, I would say, 35%. Cody says, I wonder how much gender inequality in pay correlates with income inequality in general. That's a good question. Do you mean, like when you say income inequality, do you mean just how big of the income inequality is in a country? So between the highest earners and the lowest earners? Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but that's a really good question. So going back to research, women are not getting nearly as many NIH awards as men. And then this is from a paper that analyzed first author manuscripts or publications. So this is percent. So the light blue up here are male authors, and the red, or whatever color that is, orange, is female. And you can see, there's this huge gap in how many, who's writing. And up here, these are different disciplines. So math, I don't know if you can read this, but physics, computer science, engineering. And so this little piece of the pie are the women who are publishing in each of those disciplines. And then here you see this all over the world. And in some places it is actually evening out. Like this one is Argentina, looks about 50-50. But in most places, it's much more men than women who are publishing. As I'm sure you are all aware, COVID has really shown a spotlight on inequality in general all over the world, but gender inequality as well. In that with school closures, many women are having to give up their jobs, staying home with kids, or just stalling in their careers. I saw a statistic just the other day, which I didn't put in this presentation, so I'm not sure I'm going to remember it, but it was something like 485,000 women have left the workforce in the US since COVID began, and about 200,000 men. So it's really just blowing up the issue of gender inequality. And I found this article that was just published entitled "Where are the Women? Gender Inequalities in COVID-19 Research Authorship." So even in COVID research, women are just not there. And so I actually didn't pull out any of the data from this paper, but essentially men are disproportionately writing the papers about COVID-19. The Nobel Prize winners in chemistry this year, the women who discovered CRISPR, are the first women-only team to win the prize, which is bonkers. Yeah. Oh, thanks. I'm not sure what your name is, SZE, but thank you for that link to the wage gap. So just a bit of good news before I end. The unadjusted gender gap in median earnings is decreasing. So this is over time from 1970. So we are starting to make some progress on that gap. And you can see, in some countries, more progress is being made, in others, less progress. In ours, it's a pretty steady decline. So that's just a bit of a positive note. And the other thing I just want to end with, which is actually the whole reason why I wanted to give this talk, is that international funding agencies are starting to pay attention to this. So this is an article that was just published yesterday about the European Commission, and they've just released an announcement that says that, they propose to develop an inclusive gender equality plans with member states and stakeholders in order to promote EU gender equality in R&I. So they're looking at the fact that women remain significantly underrepresented within Europe's research community, and they are starting to take action. And the same thing with the NIH, actually. So the NIH so this is a slightly different topic, but it's part and parcel with what we're discussing. In recent years, the NIH has been increasingly aware of a problem of sexual harassment among recipients of its awards. And as a result of that, it has launched a new initiative to ensure that there is gender training and sexual harassment training, essentially, at the institutions where its funding goes. So that's a step towards, it's not the same thing as saying, we're going to make a goal that women get 50% of the funding or something like that, which would be good. But at least thinking about the culture of gender discrimination, bias, and sexual misconduct in institutions where its funding goes is a step in the right direction. And with that, I just want to remind you all to vote. Now's the time. And if you feel like I do that equality is important, there's no time better than now to make your voice heard with your vote. And thank you to Cody and Hasib for the link. iwillvote.com. That's all I've got. And I think we have, well, okay, we don't actually. I've already gone over. But why don't we just take 3 minutes for any discussion or questions that people have? Anisha says, do we know anything about gender pay equity at UW? That is a really great question. I don't have statistics off the top of my head, but I'm fairly certain that we have a gender pay problem. UW has mechanisms in place to try to at least equalize gender or pay between the genders at different levels. But the problem is that when you get to the very highest levels, we're talking about chairs of departments or deans, they're still way overrepresented by men. So if you look at the income breakdown at UW, you'll find that overall there's still that gap and men are making more, but that at least by level, it's approaching equality, although it's not there. Thank you all for all of the advice about voting. And I live in Nairobi. I'm in Nairobi right now, and I have already voted in King County. If you want to reach out to me about voting, I'm happy to help you do that. I don't think that Washington has sent out ballots yet to people who are in state, but they have sent out ballots to people who are abroad. So I got my email ballot. Any other questions about gender or sex or?
Well, great. Thank you, Eliza. That was awesome.